Hey everyone, welcome back to Steve's View. If you've been watching the news lately, you've probably heard about this explosive fight in Washington over what's being called the Save America voting bill. On the surface, it sounds incredibly simple, almost too simple to argue about. The idea is, if you want to vote, you should show ID. That's it. Right. But here's the reality. This isn't just about showing ID, not even close. What's actually happening right now in the United States Senate is a political battle that goes way deeper than most people realize. And if you only look at the headline, voter ID required, you're missing the entire game being played underneath. So let's slow this down and really unpack it. Because once you understand what's actually inside this bill, and more importantly, why both parties are fighting so hard over it, you start to see something much bigger. This isn't just about election security. It's about power. It's about who votes, who doesn't, and ultimately who wins. Now first, let's talk about what this bill actually does, because this is where a lot of people get misled. Most Americans, when they hear voter ID, they imagine something straightforward. You walk into a polling place, you show your ID, you vote. That's how it works in many countries. And honestly, that's how a lot of Americans assume it already works here. But this bill goes far beyond that. Under this proposal, you wouldn't just need an ID, you would need proof of citizenship at the time of registration for federal elections. That means documents like a birth certificate or a passport. A standard driver's license wouldn't necessarily be enough unless it explicitly confirms your citizenship status, which in many states it does not. Think about that for a second. Millions of Americans have driver's licenses, but far fewer have passports and birth certificates. A lot of people don't carry those around or even know where they are. Replacing them can take time, money, and paperwork. So already, we're not just talking about show your ID, we're talking about raising the bar for what counts as valid participation in a federal election. And it doesn't stop there. The bill also requires states to regularly clean their voter rolls using federal databases, removing anyone who might be ineligible. On paper, that sounds like basic maintenance, keeping the system accurate. But in practice, that process can be messy. Databases aren't perfect. Mistakes happen, people can get flagged incorrectly, and once you're removed, getting back on the list isn't always easy. Then there's mail-in voting. This is where things really start to heat up. The bill would significantly limit who can vote by mail, restricting it mainly to groups like military personnel, people with disabilities, or those with specific approved reasons. And even then, voters would have to include identification documents with their ballots. Now compare that to the current system in many states, where mail-in voting has become much more widely accessible, especially after the pandemic. So what you're looking at is not just an ID requirement. It's a package of changes that, taken together, would reshape how Americans vote. And that brings us to the real question. If most Americans support voter ID laws, why is this so controversial? This is where things get interesting. Polls consistently show that a large majority of Americans, including many Democrats, support the idea of requiring ID to vote. So if that's true, why is there such fierce opposition in Congress? The answer is simple, but it's not something politicians always say out loud. Because the fight isn't really about ID, it's about who those rules affect. Different voting rules don't impact all groups equally. That's just a fact. Some people have easier access to documents. Some people move more frequently. Some rely more on mail-in voting. Some have more flexibility to navigate bureaucratic systems. When you change the rules, you change who shows up. And when you change who shows up, you change election outcomes. That's the part that turns a technical policy debate into a political war. Supporters of the bill argue that these measures are about restoring trust in elections. They say requiring proof of citizenship ensures that only eligible voters participate, and tightening procedures reduces the risk of fraud, even if that fraud is rare. From this perspective, the goal is simple: protect the integrity of the system. And to be fair, that argument resonates with a lot of people. Elections only work if people believe in them. If trust erodes, the entire system becomes unstable. But opponents see something very different. They argue that this bill is less about security and more about restriction, that it creates barriers especially for groups that are statistically less likely to have easy access to the required documents or resources. They point to historical examples where voting rules were used to exclude certain populations, and they worry that this is a modern version of the same idea, even if it looks different on the surface. So now, you have two completely different interpretations of the same policy. One side sees protection, the other sees exclusion, and both sides believe they're defending democracy. Now, let's zoom out even further, because there's another layer here that explains why this fight is so intense. In the United States, elections are not run entirely by the federal government. They're primarily administered by the states. That's a fundamental part of how the system was designed. So when the federal government steps in and tries to impose nationwide standards, it raises a constitutional question. How much control should Washington have over elections? This bill leans toward more federal involvement, setting rules that states must follow for federal elections. And that alone is enough to trigger resistance, even among some members of the same party pushing the bill. Which brings us to the current situation in the Senate. Despite all the attention, all the pressure, and all the rhetoric, the reality is that this bill is extremely unlikely to pass. Why? Because of the rules of the Senate itself. To move most major legislation forward, you need 60 votes to overcome a filibuster. Right now, the party supporting this bill does not have those numbers, and the opposing party is unified against it. That means even if the bill has majority support, it still can't get across the finish line. And here's where things take a sharp turn into political strategy. Because if you know a bill is unlikely to pass, but you push it anyway, what are you really trying to do? This is where you have to stop thinking about this as a legislative effort and start seeing it as a messaging tool. Pushing this bill sends a signal. It tells voters, we are the party that stands for election security. It forces the other side to publicly oppose something that can be framed as common sense reform. It puts pressure on members of Congress to take a clear position, yes or no. And that has consequences, especially in an election cycle, for supporters. This is a way to energize their base and define the issue on their terms. For opponents, it's a defensive battle trying to explain why they oppose a bill that, at a surface level, sounds reasonable to many people. So even if the bill fails, it still serves a purpose. In fact, you could argue that passing the bill was never the only goal, maybe not even the primary one. Because in politics, sometimes the fight itself is the strategy, and that brings us to one of the most important questions. Could this be done another way? There's been talk about using executive power trying to implement parts of these changes without going through Congress. But that approach runs into serious legal limits. Federal law already sets certain standards for voter registration, and any attempt to override those through executive action would likely face immediate challenges in court. So while there may be ways to influence the system at the margins, a sweeping overhaul like this almost certainly requires legislation. And right now, that legislation is stuck. So where does that leave us? It leaves us in a place where the debate is far from over. Because even if this specific bill fails, the issues behind it are not going away. Questions about election integrity, voter access, federal versus state control, these are going to keep coming back, cycle after cycle, and each time, the details will matter. Because as we've seen, the difference between everyone agrees and total political war often comes down to what's actually inside the policy. So the next time you hear someone say, "It's just about showing ID," you should pause, because it's not just about that. It's about how the rules are written, who those rules affect, and what kind of system those rules create. And once you see that, the entire debate starts to look very different, not simpler, but clearer. And maybe that's the real takeaway here. In politics, the biggest fights are rarely about what they seem to be on the surface. They're about the deeper structures underneath. And right now, that structure is being contested in a very big way. not just over a bill, but over the future shape of American elections. Thanks for watching.